In 1735, a Swedish ship called the Gothenburg left the harbor at Gothenburg loaded with silver and a crew of men who knew there was a reasonable chance they would not come back alive. Their destination was Canton, China. Their mission was embarrassingly simple: bring back tea. The voyage would take over a year each way through pirate-infested waters around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean. Entire crews died of scurvy, shipwreck, and dysentery on these journeys. And they did it for dried leaves. That should tell you something about what we are actually dealing with here. The accidental leaf. So let us start at the beginning. And the beginning, as it so often does in these stories, involves a legend that is probably not entirely true, but points at something that definitely is. Around 2700 BC, according to a Chinese tradition, an emperor named Shen Nung was sitting beneath a tree while his servants boiled water for him to drink. A few leaves drifted off the branches above and fell directly into the pot. Shen Nung, who was known as a curious experimenter and herbalist, decided to taste the accidental brew instead of throwing it out. He liked it. Now, Shen Nung may or may not have been a real person in the way we think of historical figures. Historians debate this constantly, but here is what is not debatable. The Camellia sinensis plant, the single species that produces every type of tea on earth, green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, all of it, originated in the Yunnan region of southwestern China. And people living in those mountains were chewing tea leaves and brewing primitive versions of the drink thousands of years before any European knew the plant existed. Here's the part that catches most people off guard. Every cup of tea you have ever drunk in your entire life came from the same species of plant. One plant. The differences between a delicate Japanese green tea and a bold Assam breakfast blend are not differences of species. They are differences of processing. How the leaves were grown, when they were picked, how they were handled afterward. One plant producing thousands of completely different experiences. That is either a remarkable fact about botany or a remarkable fact about human ingenuity, and honestly, it is probably both. For the first several centuries, tea was not a drink in any sense you would recognize. It was medicine. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, describe tea as a treatment for headaches, fatigue, and digestive problems. People ground the leaves into thick pastes, pressed them into bricks, and boiled chunks of those bricks in water with salt, ginger, and sometimes onion. If you serve that version at a trendy cafe today, you would get exactly one Yelp review, and it would not be kind. From medicine chest to art form. The transformation from bitter medicinal brick to something people actually enjoyed drinking for pleasure happened slowly over hundreds of years. But the real turning point, the moment tea stopped being a folk remedy and became a cultural institution, came during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. And it came because of one obsessive orphan with very strong opinions about water temperature. His name was Lu Yu. He had been raised by Buddhist monks, which, as career origins go, is not the most obvious path to becoming the world's first celebrity tea critic. But Lu Yu spent years traveling across China, visiting tea-growing regions, studying preparation methods, arguing passionately about which water sources produced the best flavor, and documenting everything with the kind of fanatical attention to detail that today would probably get him a very successful podcast. In 760 AD, he published a book called the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea. It was the first book in human history written entirely about tea. It covered everything: how to grow it, how to process the leaves, what kind of vessels to brew it in, which mountain springs produced superior water, how to identify good leaves from bad. Lu Yu turned tea from a casual habit into an art form with rules, philosophy, and standards that had to be met. The Tang Dynasty emperor was so impressed that tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The government looked at what Lu Yu had done. looked at how many people were suddenly drinking this stuff with genuine enthusiasm, and thought exactly what governments throughout history always think when they see something popular. We should take a percentage of that. They did. But here is where tea's story gets much bigger than China. Buddhist monks had been drinking tea for centuries to stay alert during long meditation sessions. Hours of sitting still in complete silence is considerably easier when you have caffeine on your side. As Buddhism spread along trade routes into Korea and Japan, the monks brought tea with them, and in doing so they accidentally became the most effective distribution network for a beverage in the ancient world. Japan steals the concept and makes it better. Tea arrived in Japan around the 8th century. A Buddhist monk named Aichu is credited with serving it to Emperor Saga in 815 AD, and the emperor liked it enough to order tea plants cultivated near the capital. That is a good review by any standard. But Japanese tea culture really exploded a few centuries later when a monk named Aisai brought powdered green tea, matcha, back from China in 1191. Aisai wrote his own book promoting tea's health benefits and specifically marketed it to the samurai warrior class as a tool for focus and mental discipline. This was a genuinely brilliant strategic decision. If you can convince the most respected warrior class in your society that drinking your product makes them better at being warriors, you have essentially solved your marketing problem forever. The samurai loved it, and over the next few centuries, the Japanese tea ceremony known as chanoyu evolved into one of the most refined cultural rituals in human history. A 16th century tea master named Sen no Rikyu codified the ceremony into its most celebrated form, built around 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Every movement in the ceremony had meaning. Every placement of every object was deliberate. The tea room itself was kept deliberately small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats in total, roughly 81 square feet, forcing everyone who entered, including the most powerful warlords in Japan, to bow low at the entrance. Think about what that means. The most feared men in feudal Japan had to physically humble themselves just to drink tea. Sen no Rikyu designed a ritual that used a cup of matcha to remind the most powerful people in the room that rank was temporary and presence was everything. That is not a tea ceremony. That is philosophy with better snacks. Sen no Rikyu was eventually ordered to commit ritual suicide by the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1591, for reasons historians still argue about. Whether the tea ceremony itself had anything to do with it remains unclear. But the ceremony survived him, and it is still practiced today with essentially the same movements, the same principles, and the same small rooms forcing powerful people to bow. China evolves, the world starts watching. While Japan was turning tea into a spiritual discipline, China kept refining the drink itself. The Song dynasty, which ran from 960 to 1279, shifted from boiled brick tea to whisked powdered tea. Then the Ming dynasty, starting in 1368, moved to loose leaf steeping. People began placing whole dried leaves directly into hot water and simply waiting, which is, give or take a few centuries of accumulated technique, basically what you do when you make tea this morning. By this point, tea was flowing along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes into Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. Traders in cities like Samarkand and Istanbul were buying and selling Chinese tea alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. Arab and Persian cultures adopted tea enthusiastically. It showed up in markets across the Islamic world. Europe, meanwhile, had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. The continent that would eventually become the most aggressively tea-obsessed civilization in human history was, at this point, drinking ale with breakfast and genuinely proud of it. Europe discovers tea and immediately starts wars over it. The Portuguese stumbled across tea through their trading posts in Macau in the early 1500s and treated it as a curiosity. Given what tea would eventually be worth, that is one of the more expensive miscalculations in commercial history. The Dutch paid attention. By 1610, They were importing tea into Amsterdam, and within decades it had spread among wealthy European elites who found it exotic, sophisticated, and extremely expensive, which in that era meant they could not get enough of it. But the real turning point did not come from a trade deal. It came from a wedding. In 1662, King Charles II married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza, who was already a devoted tea drinker. She brought the habit to the English court. The aristocracy scrambled to copy her, and within a generation tea had traveled from the royal court to the middle class to the working class. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being a novelty and became a national characteristic. The British East India Company noticed immediately and pivoted toward tea as ruthlessly as any corporation has ever pivoted toward anything. Their problem was that China did not want British goods in return. The trade was entirely one-directional, and Britain was hemorrhaging silver. So they found something China's population would accept whether the government wanted them to or not. Opium. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted. When China destroyed 20,000 chests of British opium in 1839, Britain went to war. They won, seized Hong Kong, and forced open Chinese markets. All of that over tea. The greatest corporate espionage in history. But the British had another plan running at the same time, and this one involves one of the most audacious acts of corporate espionage in recorded history. The East India Company wanted to break China's monopoly on tea production entirely. If Britain could grow its own tea somewhere in the empire, it would never again be dependent on Chinese supply, Chinese pricing, or Chinese goodwill. The only problem was that nobody outside China fully understood how tea was actually processed. The growing was one thing. The series of precise steps that transformed a fresh leaf into a drinkable product. The withering, the rolling, the oxidation, the firing. Those techniques had been refined over centuries and guarded with the kind of secrecy that the Chinese treated as a matter of national economic importance. So the company hired a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune and sent him to steal it all. What Fortune did next deserves its own film, and frankly it is remarkable that nobody has made one yet. He shaved the front of his head, grew out a long braided queue, dressed in traditional Chinese robes, hired 2 Chinese servants to help him pass as a mandarin from a distant province, and traveled deep into the closely guarded tea-growing regions of Fujian and the Wuyei Mountains. Areas where foreigners were strictly forbidden. Areas where being caught would have been, let us say, professionally and personally catastrophic. Fortune did not just grab a few plants and run. He was not there for a quick theft. He spent months studying how tea was processed, learning the precise techniques that the Chinese had spent centuries perfecting. He collected over 20,000 tea seedlings and approximately 17,000 germinated seeds. He packed them into specially designed glass cases called Wardian cases that kept the plants alive across long ocean voyages. And he recruited 8 Chinese tea processing experts and convinced them to relocate to India. He then delivered everything to the Darjeeling region in the foothills of the Himalayas, where the elevation reaches 7,000 feet, and cool mountain mist creates ideal growing conditions. He also sent plants to the Assam region in northeastern India, where a wild variety of tea plant had been discovered growing naturally in 1823. Within 20 years, Indian tea production exploded. British-owned plantations in Assam, Darjeeling, and later Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, were producing enough tea to supply the entire British Empire. China's centuries-old monopoly was broken. The cost was not paid by the British. Plantation labor in India and Ceylon was brutal. Workers, many of them Tamil migrants brought to Ceylon from southern India, worked grinding hours for almost nothing in conditions that sat uncomfortably close to forced labor. The social and economic scars from that era have not fully healed. Entire communities exist today in a state of deep poverty in those plantation regions. Descendants of workers brought there to make British tea affordable, who never fully benefited from the wealth their labor created. The company got its tea. the workers got considerably less. Tea starts a revolution. While the British were busy reshaping the global tea trade through colonialism and corporate espionage, tea was playing a very different and surprisingly explosive role on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. By the 1770s, American colonists were drinking enormous quantities of tea. It was their most popular non-alcoholic beverage. But the British Parliament had imposed the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, and attached a tax the colonists had no vote in approving. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," gets taught in every American history class. What sometimes gets left out is that the specific taxation that pushed colonists closest to open revolt was a tax on tea. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, some of them disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships sitting in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. That is roughly 92,000 pounds of tea worth about $1.7 million in today's money, destroyed in a single night of deliberate, organized political defiance. The Boston Tea Party is remembered as a revolutionary act, which it was. But it was also an act of extraordinary economic destruction carried out by people so furious about a beverage tax that they were willing to throw an enormous quantity of product into the harbor and deal with the consequences. The consequences were severe. Britain responded with punitive legislation. Tensions escalated, and within 2 years, the American Revolution had begun. Here is the other consequence, the one that shaped daily life in America for the next 250 years. After the Tea Party, drinking tea became associated with British loyalty. Patriots switched to coffee as an act of political identity. That cultural shift stuck so completely that the United States today remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea by an overwhelming margin. The American preference for coffee is not a matter of taste. It is a political statement made in 1773 that nobody ever quite rescinded. The drink that fueled an empire. Back in Britain, tea culture was not just surviving. It was accelerating into something that would define British identity for centuries. The afternoon tea tradition, often credited to Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, around 1840, became a fixture of British social life. The story goes that the Duchess experienced what she described as a sinking feeling in the late afternoon, the long gap between lunch and dinner leaving her genuinely hungry and possibly a little irritable. She began requesting a tray of tea, bread, butter, and cake around 4 in the afternoon. She started inviting friends. The friends told other friends. And within a few decades, afternoon tea had spread across every social class in the country. Which is lovely, and also slightly funny. One of the great British cultural institutions apparently started because a duchess got peckish at 3 o'clock. Factory workers in Manchester drank strong black tea with milk and sugar from chipped mugs. Lords and ladies in country estates drank it from fine imported china. Tea was functioning as a kind of social glue in a society that was otherwise deeply unequal. A daily ritual that everyone participated in, regardless of where they sat in the hierarchy. The Industrial Revolution made tea consumption explode even further, and for a reason that sounds strange until you think about it carefully. Tea was cheap. The caffeine it provided kept factory workers alert during shifts that stretched 12 to 14 hours. And the boiling water required to brew it killed the bacteria living in the untreated, contaminated water that workers would otherwise have been drinking directly. In other words, tea accidentally functioned as a public health intervention. Cities in the early Industrial Revolution had water supplies that were genuinely dangerous. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Boiling water to brew tea meant that working-class families were drinking safer water than they realized, without understanding the mechanism behind why they felt better. Some historians argue that tea literally made the Industrial Revolution possible by keeping the workforce alive and functional. That is either the greatest unintentional contribution of a beverage to economic history or an indictment of 19th century urban infrastructure. Probably both. By the late 1800s, tea was the lifeblood of the British Empire. The shipping itself became spectacle. In the 1850s and 60s, great tea clipper ships raced each other from China to London, competing to deliver the season's first cargo. The fastest ship commanded the highest price. The most famous race in 1866 saw 5 clippers leave Fuzhou on the same day and arrive in London 99 days later, with the taping beating the Ariel by just 20 minutes after a 14,000-mile voyage. Newspapers covered the races like sporting events. Crowds gathered at the docks. Tea had become entertainment. Tea goes global and gets weird. Then came the 20th century, and tea started getting strange in ways nobody predicted. In 1904, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, a tea merchant named Richard Bleckenden had a problem. He was trying to sell hot tea to fairgoers in the middle of a brutal summer heat wave. Nobody wanted a steaming cup of anything. So he dumped ice into the tea and served it cold. Iced tea was born. Today, roughly 80% of tea consumed in the United States is iced, which means the country that started drinking coffee specifically to avoid tea now drinks more iced tea than almost any nation on earth. History has a sense of humor. Around the same time, the tea bag appeared, and it appeared in the most accidental way imaginable. In 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan began sending samples to customers in small silk pouches. The customers, not realizing they were supposed to open the pouches and empty the tea out, just dropped the whole thing into hot water. It worked. Sullivan switched to cheaper gauze bags, and the tea bag industry was born. Tea purists, particularly in China and Japan, regard the tea bag with approximately the same enthusiasm that a classical musician regards elevator music. But for the average person who wants a drinkable cup of tea in under 3 minutes without cleaning up loose leaves, the tea bag was transformative. Convenience drove consumption to levels that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Meanwhile, tea culture was evolving in completely different directions in completely different places around the world. In India, chai became the national drink. A spiced tea brewed with milk, sugar, cardamom, ginger, and sometimes cloves and cinnamon, sold by chai wallas from carts and stalls on every corner of every city. There is a particular pleasure in standing on a street in Mumbai or Delhi, holding a small clay cup of fresh chai that no amount of chain coffee shop atmosphere has ever successfully replicated. Chai wallas became as iconic to Indian cities as the cities themselves, which is quietly remarkable given that the British introduced tea to India as a colonial commodity, and Indians responded by making it entirely and distinctly their own. In Morocco, mint tea became a cornerstone of hospitality so deep that refusing a cup in someone's home is considered genuinely impolite. The tea is made strong, sweetened generously, poured from a dramatic height to create a frothy top, and served 3 times. Each cup is said to carry a different meaning. The ritual of it, the pouring, the offering, the accepting, says things about welcome and respect that words alone cannot quite manage. In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the national drink in the early 20th century after the Ottoman Empire lost control of coffee-producing regions. Turkish tea, called say, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot and served in small tulip-shaped glasses that make it look elegant even when the tea inside could strip paint. Turkey now consumes more tea per person than any other country on earth, over 6.5 pounds per person per year. This is a country that invented coffee as the world knows it and then switched to tea. Never underestimate what geopolitics can do to a national beverage preference. In Tibet and the Himalayan regions, butter tea made by churning strong tea with yak butter and salt has been a caloric staple for centuries. At altitudes above 14,000 feet, where farming is almost impossible and the cold is punishing. Butter tea provides fat, calories, and hydration simultaneously. It tastes nothing like what most of the world calls tea. It tastes, to be honest, like something you would drink if you genuinely needed to survive and flavor was a secondary concern, which is exactly the context it was designed for. And then there is matcha, which deserves its own moment. For centuries, matcha was a niche product used mainly in Japanese tea ceremonies and Buddhist monasteries. It required extraordinary labor to produce. The tea plants are shaded for several weeks before harvest to boost chlorophyll and amino acid content. The leaves are stone ground into a fine powder that takes an hour to produce a single ounce. It was never going to be a mass market product, until around 2010, when it suddenly was. Matcha lattes appeared in coffee shops across the United States and Europe. Health food stores marketed it as a superfood. Instagram filled with photographs of bright green drinks next to carefully arranged ceramics. By 2020, the global matcha market was worth nearly $4 billion and growing fast. A ceremonial tradition that Buddhist monks had maintained for over 800 years became, in the space of about a decade, a wellness aesthetic on social media. Sen no Rikyu would have had thoughts about this. It is probably better that he is not around to share them. What your cup actually means today. Tea is produced in more than 50 countries on every inhabited continent. China remains the world's largest producer, followed by India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. Global tea production exceeds 6.5 million tons per year. Over 2 billion people drink it daily. Nearly a quarter of the entire human population starts its morning the same way. In Kenya, tea is the single largest export crop and employs more than 3 million people. In Assam, India, there are over 800 tea estates covering roughly 770,000 acres. The global tea industry generates over $200 billion annually. Every single leaf of that tea, from the most carefully hand-picked Darjeeling first flush to the most efficiently machine-processed commodity bag, comes from the same species. Camellia sinensis. One plant. That is all of it. The only differences are in what happens after the picking. Green tea is heated quickly to stop oxidation before it starts. Black tea is fully oxidized. Oolong falls somewhere between the two. White tea is the least processed of all, essentially just dried leaves. One plant, treated differently, producing thousands of completely different results. It is either beautifully simple or almost absurdly complex, depending on how long you think about it. Think about what tea has actually done. It started as a few leaves blowing into a pot of boiling water, somewhere in the mountains of Yunnan, 5,000 years ago. It became a medicine, then a luxury, then a tax revenue source for dynasties. Buddhist monks carried it across Asia. A Scottish botanist in a fake queue stole it from China. It moved through human civilization like almost nothing else, shaping governments, starting wars, funding empires, and sparking at least one revolution. The Boston Tea Party, the Opium Wars, the clipper ship races that drew London crowds, the factory workers kept alive by boiled water they thought was just a hot drink. All of it, connected by a single domesticated plant from the mountains of southwestern China. During both world wars, the British government considered tea so essential to military and civilian morale that it was among the first items rationed to guarantee supply. Winston Churchill reportedly argued that tea was more important to his soldiers than ammunition. That is almost certainly an exaggeration. But the fact that it was said that anyone in a wartime government was having a serious conversation about the psychological importance of a hot beverage during active combat tells you everything about what tea had become by the 20th century. It had stopped being a drink. It had become a ritual, a comfort, a daily anchor in the middle of whatever chaos the world was generating that particular week. The cup of tea you make in the morning connects you to Tang Dynasty scholars arguing about water temperature, to Japanese samurai learning stillness from a bowl of matcha, to Irish dock workers in Liverpool building new lives after famine, to American colonists furious enough about a tax to throw an enormous quantity of perfectly good product into a harbor, to a monk in a small room in China letting leaves fall into water and deciding to taste what happened next. That is a lot of history to dissolve into a cup. But there it is, sitting in your kettle, waiting to be noticed. Not bad for a wild shrub from a mountain nobody outside Yunnan had ever heard of. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of tea's history surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can find it.